Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Christina Langell. Local officials caught defying Pennsylvania election law may find themselves without a job. Representative Joe Dorsey, a Republican from York, is drafting legislation that would give the State House the power to remove county and municipal officials from office. It's similar to the impeachment process and would ultimately require voter approval. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, can you explain a little about what happened during the election that brought us here?
Let's rewind back to November 5th, shall we? We had several statewide races, most notably the presidential race and a few other row offices, and then, of course, the U.S. Senate race between Bob Casey and Dave McCormick. All of those races, except for Casey and McCormick, were decided pretty handedly on election night early the next morning. With the case of Casey and McCormick, the race was neck and neck, and McCormick's lead dwindled from about 30,000 votes to 17,000 votes by the time all was said and done. This is an incredibly narrow margin given that Trump carried the state by somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 votes. So when you look at that in context, McCormick has barely won his race. Casey was going for his third term in Congress, and so his loss is a bit of an upset, although perhaps not surprising given the success of Republicans in other statewide offices. That being said, some of the counties where the two candidates were especially close really ran into some issues when it came down to how they would count ballots that were provisionally cast or mail-in ballots that came in with errors such as missing dates or incorrect dates. State Supreme Court has said that ballots that have defects with the date do not count. However, there were some county officials, and counties run the elections in Pennsylvania. There were some county officials who didn't think that that was the correct way to handle the situation, and that dating errors were not worth throwing those ballots out. They considered it to be disenfranchising. We're talking, only a couple of hundred votes here and there. And it would not have changed the outcome of the election, to be clear. However, it's more of an ideological standpoint given the tense nature of election law in Pennsylvania over the last 4 years. And so because the race was so close, within half a percentage point, the state has a process for recounting that is automatically triggered when the margin is that narrow. The losing candidate can waive off that process and say, that's okay, I don't want it. Casey didn't do that here, even though the Associated Press came out several days after the election and determined that he could not win because he had lost his margins in the contested counties such as Bucks County and Delaware County and Chester County and in these southeastern Pennsylvania counties near Philadelphia. His margins there had shrunk so much that he would be unable to regain ground and overtake McCormick, who obviously dominated him in more rural areas of the state. And so Casey's campaign was just not prepared to accept that reality, or perhaps they wanted to draw attention to the fact that we do have from their perspective, disenfranchising laws surrounding mail-in votes.
So was this completely unprecedented, or have there been complaints about the process before?
This particular incident in which county officials defied the Supreme Court standing that these ballots don't count, this has not exactly happened in this fashion. And by what I mean is they openly defied it. In Bucks County, one of the commissioners was on record at a public meeting saying that she knew full well what the court said and that she didn't agree with it, and that if this is what it took to get the court's attention, then so be it. So that sort of outspoken defiance of what's been so far settled in court is unprecedented. However, this is not the first time that the legitimacy of ballots without proper dates or any dates at all has been challenged. And ironically enough, the last statewide candidate to challenge this issue was McCormick himself, because he ran in 22 in the Republican primary, and he narrowly lost to Dr. Oz that year. And so he opted for the recount, and he still lost at the end of the day. But one of the big arguments from his campaign was this very same issue. And so now, 2 years later, they've come back and said, well, hold on. The court said that these ballots don't count, so this should be dropped, and the counties should be reprimanded for what they're doing here.
So the legislation that was proposed by Representative Dorsey, how would the removal process work?
Very similar to an impeachment process. Now, the bill hasn't been introduced yet, so we're not certain exactly what language is in there, but the broad strokes is that it would originate in the House. They would approve this measure, and then it would be kicked to the voters of that respective county, and for them to ultimately decide if their county official in question should be effectively impeached. It comes from a place of exactly what happened in Bucks County. That is certainly the driving impetus, and that is what Representative Dorsey and others in support of this legislation have said specifically. But as far as taking it to this level of having state intervention in local office holders and trying to terminate their terms early, that is not something that we've seen in recent memory. Most of the time, these sort of impeachment processes are limited to other state officials.
So is there potential for this to be abused or used in ways outside of a county official overseeing an election? Is there a possibility that this could be used to just kind of settle political disputes?
It would depend certainly on the way the legislation is drafted. I wouldn't be surprised if that was an argument that was made against something like this. Whenever state officials want to stick their nose in, for lack of a better phrase, into local politics, it's not always received well. There's a lot of push and pull between local governance and state governance in Pennsylvania, and perhaps not just because they may be in an opposite political party, but perhaps the county officials, and I could imagine that this would be the case, that they would really struggle with this legislation as overstepping bounds. I think that the obvious response here is this is why we have elections, so that if the people themselves felt that these officials were not carrying out the job that they were elected to do, then of course they should be removed from office, and that perhaps the state stepping in and trying to force their hand on this issue would be an overreach and perhaps, as you mentioned, an opportunity to settle a political score. We see this complaint in higher forms of government. There's fears that officials will weaponize certain parts of government and their legislative power in order to punish their enemies. But fortunately, we have a great set of checks and balances that normally stops that from happening. Not in every case, but that's what, journalism is for. The state, too, has these checks and balances. And although the Pennsylvania Freedom Caucus is very on board with this idea, there are an entire Democratic Party in the House and then an entire upper chamber in the Senate that would have to be supportive of this, and not, even if the Senate wasn't involved in the legislative process or the impeachment process, as it were, they would still have to decide not to intervene in the sense of competing legislation. The Shapiro administration could sue. There's a lot of avenues that could be traversed in order to stop something like this. And I believe that fear of political retribution would be a main concern in those cases.
Do you think it has the possibility to gain traction?
At this point, no. Again, that goes to the checks and balances in the House and how the voters set up the General Assembly for the next 2 years. Republicans comfortably control the Senate. And in the House, we have a very, very close majority by the Democrats. They hold one seat. But because of that one seat, they're going to control the legislative calendar. And it's my understanding, at least at this point, that this proposal does not have any Democratic support. And so if Democrats don't want to bring it up for a vote, it won't happen, and it will remain just a proposal by the Freedom Caucus to get their opinion on the record and their proposed solution to what they felt was an egregious act on the county officials' part. And the other thing that's going to happen here, presumably within the next 2 years, is that some of the court decisions that have happened regarding this issue will be relitigated. Not in the sense that our Supreme Court decision can be overturned, because it cannot. However, the decision to invalidate mail-in ballots and provisional ballots that have dating errors was not based on the merits of the underlying litigation that got to the Supreme Court. What happened was the initial lawsuit was only filed against 2 counties. And the Supreme Court said, we won't decide on this because it has to be brought against all 67 counties. And so they said, until that happens, we will not go against how the law is currently written in the fact that ballots with missing or incomplete dates or incorrect dates do not count. So there's a very strong possibility that the original plaintiffs that brought this complaint will refile it, and will refile it in all 67 counties. How quickly it will move through the system back up to the Supreme Court, it could take months, it could take years. But I think that's more likely the future of this issue than this proposal that the Freedom Caucus wants to advance.
Kristen, thanks for joining us today. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.